The stage lights burned white above me, and somewhere past the third row of that little downtown theater, a woman was crying. Not from sadness. From recognition. She kept whispering to the man beside her, "That's her. That's the girl from the video," and I stood there in a pale lavender dress with my hands folded the way I had practiced 100 times in 100 mirrors, and I realized I had absolutely no memory of putting the dress on that morning. I remembered the coffee. I remembered the argument with my sister on the phone. I remembered walking into the green room and seeing my name on the little paper taped to the mirror, Aaron Vale, guest speaker, and then a soft click somewhere behind my eyes, and then this. The lights. The lavender. The applause building like a slow tide. And the woman in the third row, wiping her cheeks, mouthing something that looked like "thank you." 6 months earlier, I would have laughed at the idea that any of this could happen to me. I was the guy who wore the same 3 flannel shirts on rotation. I was the guy who lived above a hardware store in a town nobody visits on purpose, who drove a truck older than most of my coworkers, who ate dinner standing over the sink because sitting down felt like admitting I was alone. I built decks for a living. My hands were rough. My voice was low. My beard was the same beard I had grown at 22 and never bothered to change. If you had asked anyone in Fallon Ridge to describe Aaron Vale, they would have said quiet, dependable, a little sad around the eyes, probably never getting married. And they would have been right about all 4. It started because of Margot. Margot was my landlord's daughter, and she was also, in a way I never quite figured out how to name, my only real friend. She was 31, divorced, running a little wellness studio on the 2nd floor of the same building where I rented my apartment. She taught breathwork classes and something she called guided reset therapy, which I always assumed was rich lady nonsense until the night my sister called me screaming about her mother's diagnosis, and I sat on the fire escape shaking so hard I couldn't dial anyone back. Margot came up the stairs with a mug of chamomile and sat next to me without saying a word for 40 minutes. When I finally spoke, she listened the way most people don't know how to listen. She didn't fix. She didn't advise. She just stayed. After that night, I started stopping by her studio on Thursdays. She'd close up around 8, and we'd sit on the yoga mats and split a takeout container of dumplings and talk about nothing. She never asked me to talk about my mother. She never asked me why I flinched every time someone raised their voice. She just let me be in the room. One Thursday in early March, she asked me if I would help her with an experiment. "I'm certifying in a new modality," she said, pulling her hair up into that messy knot she did when she was thinking. "Clinical hypnotherapy. I need practice hours before I can sit for the exam. I need someone who won't laugh at me halfway through." I told her I didn't believe in hypnosis. "That's fine," she said. "It doesn't need you to believe in it. It just needs you to sit down." I sat down. The first session was almost boring. She had me count backwards from 300. She had me picture a staircase. She had me imagine a room at the bottom of the staircase where I could leave anything I didn't want to carry anymore. I remember laughing when she said that last part because I thought, lady, if I could leave things in a room, I wouldn't be sitting here. But then somewhere between 200 and 180, my shoulders dropped in a way they hadn't dropped in maybe 15 years, and when she counted me back up, my face was wet, and I didn't remember starting to cry. "That's normal," she said gently. "The body remembers things the mind forgets." I came back the next Thursday, and the one after that. By the 4th week, she asked if she could try something more targeted. She had noticed, she said carefully, that I carried myself like a man who is constantly bracing for a hit. My jaw was always locked. My hands were always half-fisted. Even when I laughed, my shoulders never came down all the way. She wanted to try a suggestion protocol designed to help clients access what she called the softer register, the parts of themselves they had learned, somewhere along the way, to lock down. "Softer register," I repeated. "Everyone has one," she said. "Men especially. You just get taught to bury yours so deep you forget it's there. It's not about being less of a man. It's about not being at war with half of yourself." I told her I wasn't at war with anything. She smiled the smile of a woman who had heard that exact sentence from 100 exhausted men. "Sit down, Aaron." The session went longer than usual. Somewhere in the middle of it, I couldn't tell you when because time did that strange folding thing it does when you're deep under. She asked me to picture a room. Not the room at the bottom of the staircase. A different one. A room from before. A room I had forgotten I remembered. She said, "The first room where you felt safe. The first room where nobody was watching you. What do you see?" And I saw my grandmother's sewing room. I hadn't thought about that room in 25 years. Yellow curtains. A cedar chest under the window. The smell of lavender sachets she tucked between folded fabric. She had been the only adult in my childhood who never once told me to toughen up. When my father screamed, I would run to her house 3 blocks over, and she would let me sit on the floor of that sewing room while she worked, humming old songs, occasionally handing me scraps of fabric to fold. I remembered, suddenly, and with a clarity that punched the breath out of me, one specific afternoon when I was maybe 6 years old, and I had asked her if I could try on the dress she was hemming for a customer, and she had said, "Of course, sweetheart," arms up, and slipped it over my head, and I had stood in front of her cracked oval mirror and felt something I did not have a word for. Peace. That was the word. Or something close to it. A stillness in my chest I had never felt before and would not feel again for a very long time. My father had walked in.
I don't want to write down what he said.
Even now, 30 years later, I don't want to give those words a second life on a page. He didn't hit me. He didn't have to. He said what he said, and my grandmother's face went the color of old paper, and she quietly lifted the dress off me and folded it and never mentioned it again, and I went home with my father and understood, in the specific and permanent way children understand things, that some parts of me were not allowed to exist. I came out of the hypnosis session sobbing. Margot didn't say anything for a long time. She handed me a tissue. She let me shake. When I finally caught my breath, she said, very softly, "Aaron, I want to be really careful about what I ask you next. We can stop here. We can never touch that memory again if you don't want to. But I need you to know something. What you felt in that sewing room, that wasn't wrong. That was you. A very small piece of you that never got to grow up. And you get to decide as a grown man whether you want to let that piece finally breathe." I didn't answer her that night. I went upstairs. I sat on my bed in the dark for 3 hours. I thought about my mother dying slowly in a hospice in another state. I thought about my father dead 9 years and the fact that I still ducked my head every time I passed a man who looked like him. I thought about the fact that I was 38 years old and I had never once, in 3 decades, felt the thing I had felt in that sewing room. The next Thursday, I asked Margot if we could go back to the memory. She was careful. She was so careful. She explained that hypnotherapy couldn't make me do anything I didn't already want to do. It could only lower the volume on the voices that were shouting me down. She said if I wanted, we could do a session where I gave myself permission, just permission, not action, to imagine what it might feel like to revisit that stillness. Nothing physical had to happen. It was just an internal experiment. I said okay. We did the session. She counted me down. She walked me back to the sewing room. This time, in the imagined room, my father wasn't there. Nobody was there. Just my grandmother, humming, and the yellow curtains, and the dress on the hanger. She asked me, in that imagined room, if I wanted to try it on. In the imagined room, I said yes. I don't remember what I saw in the mirror in my mind, but I remember what my body did in the chair. My shoulders dropped. My jaw unclenched. My hands, which had been half-fisted for 30 years, opened on the armrests like they had been waiting their whole life to be told they could. When she brought me back up, I was smiling. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Quiet," I said. "I feel quiet." That was the word that ended up mattering. Quiet. Not feminine, not free, not any of the words I thought I was supposed to reach for. Just quiet. Like a radio that had been playing static my entire life had finally, briefly, been switched off. I went home that night and did something I hadn't done since I was 6 years old. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror and looked at myself. Really looked. Not the quick glance I usually gave to make sure I hadn't missed a spot shaving. A long, honest look. And I asked the man in the mirror what he wanted. He didn't answer in words, but something in his chest, low and steady, said, "Try." The following Saturday, I drove 2 hours to a city where nobody knew me. I parked in a garage. I walked into a department store the size of a small airport. I stood at the entrance to the women's section for 11 minutes before I could make my feet move. When I finally did, I was so terrified my ears were ringing. Every woman I passed felt like a witness. Every mirror felt like an accusation. I kept my head down and walked to the back of the store, where the racks were quieter, and I stood in front of a dress. It was pale lavender. I'm not going to pretend I chose it for any deep reason. I chose it because it was the color of my grandmother's sachets. I chose it because the fabric looked soft. I chose it because a middle-aged woman was folding shirts nearby and she smiled at me kindly and asked if I was shopping for my wife, and I said yes because it was easier, and she said she's a lucky woman, and I felt a strange stab of grief for a version of myself that didn't exist. I bought the dress. I bought a pair of flats. I bought, with hands that would not stop trembling, a small kit of basic makeup that a salesgirl at the counter picked out for me when I told her the same lie about a wife. She was maybe 22. She was very sweet. She said, "Tell her the tinted balm goes on before the blush. She'll love it." I drove home with the bag on the passenger seat like it was a bomb. For 4 days it sat in my closet unopened. I couldn't look at it. I couldn't throw it away. I called Margot on the 5th night and told her what I had done, and she was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "Erin, would you like to come try it on here? In the studio? After hours? Nobody will see. Nobody will know. And if you hate it, you can burn the bag in my parking lot, and we never speak of it again." I said yes before I could talk myself out of it. Thursday night. Studio locked. Blinds down. Margot in the front room making tea, giving me the whole back room to myself. I stood there for a long time, just holding the dress on its hanger. My hands were shaking again, but differently this time. Not from fear. From the specific electricity of a moment you have been waiting for your entire life without knowing it. I took off my flannel. I took off my jeans. I stood in the yellow lamplight of Margot's back room in just an undershirt and socks, and I felt, for the first time in 3 decades, the strange nakedness of being about to become someone I didn't know yet. I lifted the dress over my head. Arms up. The fabric fell down around me the way water falls. Soft, cool, forgiving in places I was used to armoring. I smoothed it down over my hips with hands that were still calloused from a week of framing decks, and the contrast of those rough hands on that soft fabric was so specific and so strange that I laughed out loud. Then I turned to the mirror. I want to be honest here because the honesty is what matters. I did not look beautiful. I didn't look like a woman. I looked like a large man in a lavender dress with a beard and a lopsided hem and legs that had never seen a razor in adult life. If somebody had shown me a photo of that moment, I probably would have hated it. But I wasn't looking at a photo. I was looking at a person. And that person, standing in that mirror, had shoulders that had come down, had hands that had opened, had eyes that were, for the first time in my adult life, not braced for a hit. I started crying so hard I had to sit down on the floor. Margot heard me. She knocked once softly. "Erin, can I come in?" I said yes. She came in and sat on the floor next to me, not touching me, not looking at the dress, just looking at my face. She said, "Tell me what's happening." I said, "I've been so tired. I've been so tired for so long and I didn't know why."
And it's this.
It's been this. My whole life, it's been this thing I wasn't allowed to have, and I've been carrying the weight of not having it, and I didn't even know what I was carrying. She nodded. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "Okay, so now we know. What do you want to do with knowing?" I didn't have an answer that night. But over the next weeks, an answer started building itself. I didn't tell anyone. I couldn't. My sister was on the phone every other day with hospice updates about my mother, and there was no room in our conversations for anything else. My coworkers on the deck crew were good men in the specific way that meant they would not have been cruel, but they also would not have understood, and I did not have the energy to teach them. So I did what people like me have done for 100 years. I built a private life. Thursday nights became the axis my week rotated around. Margot let me use the back room. I brought a small suitcase. I couldn't leave anything at my apartment because my sister sometimes stayed over, and inside the suitcase, over the weeks, a small wardrobe grew. 2 dresses, a skirt,
A blouse.
a pair of jeans cut for hips I didn't quite have, A wig, eventually, that I ordered from a website with a discreet return policy. Makeup that I got better at, slowly, embarrassingly watching tutorials on my phone in the studio bathroom. Margot never dressed me. She never styled me. She said this had to be mine, all of it, my hands, my choices, my mistakes. She sat in the front room drinking tea and reading paperbacks, while I fumbled with eyeliner in the back. Sometimes I came out and asked her opinion. She was honest without being cruel. The lipstick is too dark for your skin. Try the pink one. That skirt is fighting you. Try the A-line. Don't apologize when you walk in the room. You don't need to apologize for taking up space. That last one took me a month to stop doing. The transformation, if I'm being honest, was not really about the clothes. The clothes were the door. What happened on the other side of the door was harder to name. My shoulders stopped riding up around my ears. My voice, when I was in the back room, dropped into a register I didn't know I had. Not higher, not girlish, just softer, less braced. I started noticing small kindnesses in the world I had been walking past my whole life. The way steam curled off a mug. The way afternoon light hit the studio floor at 4:30. The way my own hands looked when they weren't clenched. I started calling her Elena, in my own head, when I was in the back room. It was my grandmother's middle name. I never said it out loud to Margot. I wasn't ready. Then, in the 7th week, everything nearly fell apart. My sister Kayla drove up unannounced on a Thursday. I was in the middle of a session. Margot's studio door was locked, but Kayla had the key to my apartment above the hardware store, and when she couldn't find me, she came down looking, and she saw the light on in the studio, and she knocked. And Margot, thinking it was me coming back from the bathroom, said, "Come in." Kayla walked into the front room of the studio. I was in the back. I heard her voice. I froze. I was in a knee-length navy dress with my hair, the wig, pinned up, and mascara, and a pair of small silver earrings I had bought on my lunch break at a mall 2 towns over. I was, in that moment, more visible as Elena than I had ever been. I could hear Margot's voice through the door, calm as a lake.
Hi.
You must be Kayla. Aaron talks about you. Where is he? Kayla's voice. Sharp. Tired. She had just come from the hospice. He stepped out to get us dinner. He should be back in 20 minutes.
Please sit down.
Can I get you tea? I don't know how Margot did that. I don't know how her voice stayed steady. I stood in the back room in the navy dress and shook so hard I thought I was going to be sick. My coat and my regular clothes were on the chair, but there was no way to get them past Kayla. There was a fire escape out the back window. There was also no way to climb down a fire escape in a knee-length navy dress and heels in early April. I did the only thing I could do. I took off the dress. I took off the wig. I wiped my face with the makeup remover wipes I now kept in the suitcase. I put on my flannel and my jeans. I shoved everything back into the suitcase and slid it under the massage table. I splashed water on my face. I looked in the mirror. There was still eyeliner smudged in the corner of my left eye. There was still a faint pink stain on my mouth. My hair, from the wig cap, was matted and strange. I fixed what I could. Then I climbed out the back window, walked around the block, came in the front of the building carrying a takeout bag I had grabbed from Margot's kitchen, cold leftover noodles, and pretended I had been out getting dinner. Kayla looked at me strangely when I walked in. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Her eyes moved over my face. She was a nurse. She noticed things nobody else noticed. I could see her clocking the pink on my mouth, the smudge by my eye. I could see her deciding, in real time, whether to ask.
She didn't ask.
She said, "Mom's asking for you. You need to come this weekend." I said I would. She left 20 minutes later. Margot and I sat in the studio in complete silence for another hour before either of us could speak. When I finally did, my voice was shaking so hard I could barely get the words out. "I can't do this anymore." Margot didn't argue with me. She said, "Okay. I can't." Kayla, almost, my mother is dying, Margot. My mother is dying, and I'm in a back room in a dress, and if my sister had walked in 10 seconds earlier. I know. What am I doing? What am I doing with my life?
You're breathing, she said.
For the first time. And it's terrifying. That's what you're doing. I couldn't hear her. I packed the suitcase. I took it home. I shoved it into the very back of my closet under a pile of insulation from a job I never finished. I drove to see my mother the next morning. I sat by her hospice bed for 4 days and held her hand and did not think about Elena, did not think about lavender, did not think about the strange quiet I had been building for myself. My mother squeezed my hand on the 3rd day and looked at me with the specific clarity dying people sometimes have and said, "Erin, you look so tired, sweetheart. What are you carrying?" I said, "Nothing, Mom." She said, "You've been saying that since you were 6 years old." That night I sat in the hospice parking lot in my truck and cried the way I had cried on Margot's floor, but harder, because now I was crying for the 6-year-old boy in the sewing room and the 38-year-old man in the parking lot at the same time. My mother died 4 days later. I stayed for the funeral. I stayed for the paperwork. I stayed to help Kayla sort through the house. I did not go back to Margot's studio for 6 weeks. I did not answer her texts. I did not open the suitcase in the back of my closet. I put the pale lavender dress out of my mind so completely that when I finally did think about it, one Tuesday morning at 4 a.m., I couldn't remember what fabric it was made of. That was the low point. Not the near miss with Kayla. Not even my mother's death. The low point was 6 weeks of nothing, 6 weeks of being back in the man-shaped box, 6 weeks of watching my shoulders climb back up around my ears and my hands close back into their old half-fists. I got quieter at work. I stopped eating. I lost 15 pounds. My foreman asked me if I was okay, and I said I was fine, and he looked at me the way people look at a house they can tell is about to collapse. On the 43rd day, Kayla called me. "I need to tell you something," she said. Her voice was strange. "Okay." When I came up to the studio that night, in April, my stomach dropped. I knew, Erin. I couldn't speak. I saw the eyeliner. I saw your mouth. I saw the wig cap line on your forehead. I'm a nurse. I see everything. And I want you to know that I sat in my car outside for 20 minutes trying to decide whether to go back in, and I decided not to because you looked terrified when you walked through the door, and I didn't want you to think I had come to hunt you down. I still couldn't speak. Mom knew too, she said. Not about that specifically, but about something. She told me, the week before she died, that her one regret was that she'd let Dad make you smaller than you were. Her exact words. Smaller than he was. She said she should have fought him. She said you were the softest little boy she'd ever met, and Dad ground it out of you, and she'd watched him do it and never said a word. She was still angry at herself, Erin. On her deathbed, she was angry at herself for that. I made a sound I didn't recognize. I don't know what you were doing at Margot's studio, Kayla said. I don't need to know the details. But if it makes you look less tired than you looked at the funeral, Erin, I want you to go back. I want you to go back tomorrow. Do you hear me? Whatever it is, I want you to go back. Mom would have wanted it too. I went back the next day. Margot opened the studio door and looked at me and didn't say anything. She just held the door open. I walked in. I went to the back room. I opened the suitcase. The pale lavender dress was on the top of the pile. I put it on. I stood in front of the mirror and I looked at myself, and this time I was not a 6-year-old in a sewing room, and I was not a terrified 38-year-old with mascara smudged in the corner of his eye. I was a grown man in a dress, with quiet shoulders and open hands, and I was, for the first time, not asking anyone's permission to exist. Margot knocked. Can I come in? Yes. She came in. She had a mug of tea. She sat on the floor. She looked at me for a long time, and then she said, Elena. I hadn't told her the name. Not out loud. Ever. How did you know? You wrote it on the tea order form 3 weeks ago, and then scribbled it out. I could still read it. I laughed. It was the first real laugh I had made in 6 weeks. It came out of me in a hiccup, then a shake, then a sob, and Margot handed me the tea, and I sat on the floor of the back room in my grandmother's color and cried and laughed at the same time until my chest was empty and clean. That could have been the ending. In a different story, it would have been. But 3 months later, Margot showed me a flyer. There was a small community event downtown. A storytelling night. People stood up on stage in front of 100 strangers and told a true story from their life. 10 minutes each. No script. Just the truth.
Aaron, she said.
I think you should sign up. I laughed at her. She didn't laugh back. I'm not going to do that, I said. Not as Aaron. As Elena. Or as both. Whichever feels right. I think you should tell the sewing room story. To strangers. To strangers who need to hear it. Margot, I don't even know what I am. I'm not a woman. I don't have a whole story yet. I just have this. Thursdays. A suitcase.
That's the whole story, she said.
That's the story people need. Not the finished person. The Thursday person. The suitcase person. The person who is figuring it out. Nobody ever hears from the person in the middle.
I said no.
I said no for 8 weeks. Then one Thursday night in September I said yes. I signed up. I picked a date. I told Kayla. She said, I'll be in the 3rd row. I told my foreman I was taking that Friday off.
He asked why.
I said, personal thing. He looked at me for a long moment and said, Aaron, you look better than you've looked in a year. Whatever the personal thing is, don't stop doing it. I nearly cried in front of him. I said thank you. I went home. The night of the event, Margot did my makeup. Just this once. She said I was going to be too shaky to do it myself, and she was right. She did it soft. Nothing dramatic. A little tinted balm. A little mascara. A little blush. She pinned the wig for me. She helped me into the pale lavender dress, the same one, the first one, the one from the department store where the middle-aged woman had thought I was shopping for my wife. She stood behind me in the mirror and put her hands on my shoulders and said, Elena, you are not going up there to explain yourself. You are going up there to tell the truth. There's a difference. Do you understand?
I said yes.
I understood. And that is how I ended up on that stage, in front of 100 strangers, in a lavender dress, with the lights burning white above me and a woman in the 3rd row crying with recognition, and no memory of putting the dress on that morning, because when you cross that particular threshold, the details go quiet. The self that had been holding the pen for 38 years finally set it down, and someone else, someone quieter and softer and older than all my fear, walked into the light. I told the sewing room story. I told about my grandmother. I told about the 6-year-old. I told about the father and the room and the words. I told about 30 years of static. I told about Margot and the staircase and the imagined room. I told about the department store and the woman folding shirts and the lie about the wife. I told about the back room and the yellow lamplight and the calloused hands on the soft fabric. I told about Kayla in the doorway. I told about my mother's regret. I told about the 43rd day and the phone call and the pale lavender dress at the top of the suitcase. I told them I did not know what I was. I told them I did not need to know yet. I told them the only thing I knew for sure was that for 32 years I had been carrying something I was not allowed to put down, and one Thursday night in a wellness studio in a town nobody visits on purpose, a woman with a mug of chamomile had told me I could put it down, and I had, and my shoulders had come down for the first time in my life, and I had understood, finally, that softness was not the enemy of manhood. Fear was. Fear had been the enemy. Fear had put the dress on the hanger and locked the sewing room door and made me walk out of my grandmother's house at 6 years old with my head down. And courage, the specific, small, embarrassing courage of standing in a lavender dress in front of a bathroom mirror at 38 years old. Courage had opened that door back up. When I finished, the room was silent for a long second. Then the woman in the 3rd row stood up. And then the man beside her. And then the whole room. And Kayla, in the 3rd row, was on her feet with tears streaming down her face, and she was clapping so hard her hands must have hurt, and Margot, in the wings, had her fist pressed against her mouth, and I stood on that stage in my grandmother's color and let the applause wash over me the way water washes over a stone that has been in the sun too long. Afterwards, in the little green room, people came up to me. A young man in a hoodie who couldn't make eye contact and said only, "Thank you," before walking away. A woman my mother's age who took my hand in both of hers and said, My son needed to hear that story 20 years ago, and I couldn't tell it to him. Thank you for telling it now." A teenager, maybe 17, who whispered, "I have a suitcase too," and disappeared into the crowd before I could answer. Kayla came in last. She hugged me for a long time. She didn't say anything for the first minute. Then she said into my shoulder, "Mom would be so proud of you, Aaron. Elena, both of you, all of you." I said, "Thank you for the third row." She said, "I'll always be in the third row." I didn't become a woman in the end. That's not the shape my story took. I didn't stop being Aaron. I didn't stop framing decks. I didn't stop wearing flannel on job sites and driving my truck home and eating dinner over the sink some nights when the loneliness came back in. Aaron stayed. Aaron was real. Aaron was mine. But Elena stayed too. Thursday nights still. Sometimes Friday nights now. Sometimes a Sunday afternoon when the light comes through my window a certain way and my grandmother's color calls me back to the closet. Kayla comes over sometimes and we make dinner together and she calls me whichever name feels right in the moment, and neither of us has to explain anything to anyone. Margot's certified in her hypnotherapy. She has a full practice now. She still gives me tea on Thursdays. And sometimes, when I'm standing in front of the mirror in the pale lavender dress, the same one, the first one, worn soft now at the seams, I think about that 6-year-old boy in his grandmother's sewing room, standing in front of the cracked oval mirror, feeling something he did not have a word for.
Peace.
That was the word. He had to wait 32 years for someone to tell him he was allowed to feel it. But he waited. He held on. He kept the memory alive in the back of a closet in the back of his mind, folded neatly between pieces of himself he was not allowed to show anyone. And when the door finally opened, through a woman with a mug of chamomile and a staircase counted backwards and a sister in a third row and a mother's last regret, he walked through it, arms up, just like his grandmother had said. And the dress came down around him like water, and his shoulders came down, and his hands opened, and he was finally quiet.